Okay, Brad is videotaping again this month, and so if you missed anything or your friends missed anything, hopefully you can get onto our website, and it's listed at the back of this double-sided handout, and the videos are posted. So, and also a link to get the handout. I'm not so tall. A link to get the handout too, so you can clean up this information. So what we had for handouts, we had the one for this month, and we had a couple of extension things over there. I don't know if everyone got them because the papers were kind of shuffling around. This one's about seed starting and transplanting. It's a little bit basic, but pretty good. And we also have the new recommended variety list for southeastern Alaska, and is back there, the local extension agent. So that one's different than the one we handed out a couple months ago because it's got the updates on it. So we're here to talk about transplants and about soil, and when we switch over to building local soils, David Lendrum will take over for me. So why would you want to grow your own transplants? Well, I almost would like to grow transplants and not garden. The transplants are kind of my favorite part of it. I can pick my own varieties. I can pick my own species. For example, if I want to grow okra, which is really dumb here. I tried it last year, and just because it worked for me in the San Juan Islands, but it really is a push here without a greenhouse. Mine never even got beyond looking yellow. They never even turned green. But I can pick my own varieties, do my own experimenting. The timing is all my own. Sometimes when they come into the stores, it's oftentimes too early or too late for me to plant them. I like to succession plant and try to find a good transplant in July. July is just the perfect time to plant your winter garden, and there isn't going to be much available. So that's part of it. It is less expensive depending on how obsessive you get with buying seed. It can be less expensive. If you just need a few plants and you have a very small space, it might actually be more cost effective to buy them. You can eliminate some diseases sometimes by growing from seed, because a lot fewer diseases are carried on seeds than they are on live plants, and you aren't bringing in the pests from wherever those plants were grown in their soil. Maybe there's earthworms you do or do not want in there, but and plus it's just a whole lot of fun, or it is for me. So you need to time them so that they are the proper size when you want to put them in your garden. For most people that will be whenever you've determined your last frost date is in your part of Juneau or wherever. May 1st is kind of an average. If you cover your garden like I do, I don't have any frost problems after April. I also make an effort to grow the more cold hardy plants, so I get pretty bold with putting them out. And because I do grow a lot of transplants, I push the limit quite a bit. I put out extras. I haven't paid a lot of money for them, so sometimes I put them out early and see if they're going to make it. I leave them in late. I grow too many. I eat the extras. I put them on the compost heap. I just go hog wild. But for your timing, most of the cold weather vegetable crops take about 4 weeks, and the plants tend to be hardier, hardier for transplanting and hardier for any weather variations when they're young. So it's almost too better to do them younger than older. Also, if they start to run out of nutrients or whatever before you get them planted and they slow down, some of them, especially the cole crops, they never really reach their peak yield that they would have if you'd have kept them growing rapidly. So cole crops like broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, all those things, you don't want them to slow down before you get them planted. So Brad, who's filming for us back there, he says that in North Douglas, he starts most of his things in mid-March and moves them to his greenhouse by mid-April, and he puts them out in mid-May in the garden. I talked to several people trying to gather some more information than just my own experiences, and Chris Personette, she puts 1 to 3 peas in the cells in early March. She also grows a whole lot of flowers, and she has covered area to put them outside. And when you're growing gardens in general, but especially transplants, there seems to be 2 different types of paths that people take on several aspects of it, aside from growing them themselves and not. One is whether or not to light them, whether or not to heat them, and a lot of them involve whether you want to pay the cost or spend the energy, or whether you want to go more basic with it. And I tend to stick more basic with it, partly because of my environmental leanings, but it also is more of a challenge for me, and I have less worry about what goes wrong if the lights aren't right or if they don't have any heat. And it makes for hardier plants, I feel, too. So I'll try to present both sides, but yeah, I lean towards the basic side of it. So for where I get my seeds, and I do order way too many, on the back of the 2-page handout, I put a few internet resources, but there are also a lot of seeds available locally. And even some of these same seed companies, like Denali, Territorial, a lot of these you can find their seeds locally. Sometimes not the entire selection, but an awful lot of the most appropriate ones at the hardware stores or the department stores. Sometimes grocery stores carry them. I've seen some at Rainbow Foods. You see them quite a few places. So the main parts that you'll need, I put pictures of them down the side there, and the top two are 72 cell trays, which is a pretty convenient size for people to start with. The second one that's shown there that's white looking, it's made out of a foam-like material, and they're called seedling trays. They're rigid and they're reusable. And that is what Sandy Williams uses to start his tomato plants. And he grows, I don't know, thousands of them every year. And he does an excellent job. Unfortunately, he wasn't available today to talk to you about that. That seems to be a sign-up sheet. So the 72 cell trays, they're about this size. And these inserts come all attached together like this. But I tend to cut them apart. I don't really plan it that way, but they end up this way because they're easier to get out, and sometimes I haven't planted 72, broccoli plants or something. I've planted a few of each, and some will be ready to go when others aren't. I can carry them to the part of the garden where I plan to transplant them. They're just in general easier to manage this way. You could keep them this way and save on labels, whatever works, but I have mine broken apart. And I do reuse them, and here's another spot where there's a fork in the road. I grow some really hardy vegetables. I make an effort to keep my transplants from getting too humid. And so I'm really lazy about sanitizing my pots. Ideally, and especially if a person is growing tiny seeds that take a long time, or from plants that aren't super hardy, maybe flowers that aren't as well adapted to our area, or just take a while, you definitely want to do some sanitizing if you reuse your containers. And the handout on transplants from the extension mentions bleach, 10% bleach for 30 minutes. I think that's really, really overkill. No greenhouse I've worked in has ever used it that strong. And basically dip it, set it, and let it dry. There's no 30-minute soak. But you do want to knock the bulk of the material out of there first. Get rid of any chunks so that the bleach soaks in better. And you may want to rinse them after 30 minutes. Like I said, I tend to just skip it. I'm also using lighter weight containers that will probably only last a few years. And I do reuse some things. This is one of my favorite combinations. I think this maybe had some store-bought tomatoes in it. It has holes in it. And the bottom one doesn't have holes. I don't know what it had in it. Baby romaine. And those two together, sometimes I'll plant a whole bunch of pea seeds that are just going to go together maybe in a tomato hoop or something and make their own little pile. So I'll plant them all together at once. But I want to have this one under here and make sure they don't sit in water. So half an hour or so after I water everything, I go by and dump the water out from below. But this is my favorite setup. And there's also the third picture on the handout. The third one down is, what are they called, Darren? Those soil blockers. It's just called soil blockers. Okay, I was going to ask what those soil blockers are called. Okay, and those come in different sizes. They're a bit more expensive. And you take your soil mix and you push this down in there several times very hard, and it makes cubes of soil basically that you release onto a flat tray. They don't seem to hold together as well if you use these floppier trays that have the corrugated bottoms. I've seen them used best when people home built a flat wooden thing with 3 sides. And then those go in the greenhouse and they're easy to handle. It's a little bit more involved, it's a more permanent system. But the blocks, when they come out of the blocker, there's an airspace between each one and it air prunes the roots. So you don't get any circling roots like you do sometimes in pots, and you don't rip any roots stuck to the sides because there's no pot to take them out of. You simply take that plug and either plant it directly in the garden or move it up to a bigger plug. So they have systems that start with tiny little plugs, and then the bigger plug has a plug hole in the middle, and it's all interchangeable, so you can get them to fit in anyway. So if you really like to play with that kind of stuff, that would be way too much fun for someone who has some time for it. For labels, you can buy labels. They come in many different shapes. I, again, take the low budget route, and I take dairy cups and cut them in half and cut those halves in half and those halves in halves until I get down to a size that works pretty well for me. I draw big. I use a black Sharpie. Black is the only color that doesn't fade in the sun, and when we do have sun. And I also always face them north in my garden so that they get even less sun. That's a habit from living in South Dakota and Iowa and places that are bright. And so they come out looking like this. I put the date on top, and if I was really organized, I would never include a year, and I would plant these things the same time every year so I could reuse the stakes, but I haven't quite got to that point. You're going to need some kind of nutrients for the plants, and you can buy soil, potting soil, that has the nutrients already in it. It's generally not organic, but you can get it that way too. Or you can buy it without any nutrients in it. And I've tried both ways. With the nutrients, you can have few more troubles with mold or damping off, which is, it's a rot that gets in the stem, and the stem just collapses and your plant falls over when it's little. You can have a few more troubles with that if you have nutrients feeding that right from the start. But at any rate, by the time your plant gets till it has true leaves or real leaves, like this little one on the back, the top two leaves are what I would say are real leaves. They have veins in them. By that time, they definitely need some fertilizer. So if you're not going to get around to doing it when they have leaves, you might as well buy the soil that has some fertilizer in it. But if you really think you're going to stay on it, then I think it's best to wait till then. These two lower leaf-looking things are, this is a seedling that has bean-type germination. They're actually the halves of the seed. Comes, in some plants, comes up above the soil and splits and turns green, but it's not a true leaf. And they have their own nutrition in them. They're part of the seed. But a lot of seeds, like peas, that thing does split open, but it stays below the soil and you'll never see it. So when you have things that actually look like leaves, that's when you need to be getting some food to these plants. And Joe Orsi said he uses soluble organic powder. A lot of people use, let's see, Chris told me she uses something out of a yellow bottle from Ace. It's some sort of starter. I think I wrote it on here somewhere, but I'm not finding it at the moment. And then the water, the warmer water you can use within reason. You know, if it's room temperature, a little warmer, the less you'll set the plants back when you do water them. I try not to use chlorinated water. I use a Brita filter, Brita pitcher for all of my inside plants. For the outside, I collect rainwater. You could use snow melt this time of year if you warmed it up a little bit. All that works. Okay. So to germinate your seedlings, seeds generally need 10 degrees Fahrenheit, or is it Celsius? Anyway, they need warmer temperatures to germinate than they do to grow. So I don't use a greenhouse. I don't use any heating pads. So when I'm germinating my seeds, I don't generally worry about the light, even though, well, lettuce I direct plant outside, so I don't worry about that. Some seeds need light, but most seeds don't. And where I find space for my transplants is on top of the refrigerator. Now the refrigerator is pumping hot air out, so it tends to be warmer. It's also up near the ceiling. Sometimes I sneak them, a few of them, onto the top of the water heater. And sometimes I just put them upstairs, maybe even on the back of the toilet if that's where I have room. But I try to put them in the warmest spot in the house and keep an eye on them. As soon as anything green comes up anywhere in the tray, I move it to the window. And that's going to be colder, but it is brighter. And the intensity drops off with the square of the distance from the window. So I try to get everything as close to it as I can without actually having a draft or anything that's going to freeze out the plants. So you usually want to plant them twice the thickness of the seed and cover it up with either some vermiculite or some very light potting soil. And then when you water it, that'll hopefully push out any of the excess airspace so there's good contact with the soil. And I buy my potting soil in the big bag that's pictured on the front. And it's usually kind of moist when I buy it. and I try not to leave the bag open so it dries out, because once the peat dries out, it's really hard to ever wet it again, and it lets off a really nasty dust. So if I can't get the bag closed, then I put some in a covered Rubbermaid tote, and if it's too dry already, add some water and let it sit for a few days so it soaks through there, because you really don't want to be breathing that kind of stuff. Okay, so Joe Orsi said he put saran wrap over the top of his to keep them humid just while they're germinating. But, and you can use a sheet of glass or a sheet of plastic to keep the moisture in. I haven't had that problem in my house. Mine never dry out while they're germinating. It's only a week, and nothing dries out in a week in my house. So I don't cover things. I leave them open where I can see what they're doing and where no mold is going to build up on them. So let's see, I talked about fertilizing. So the lighting, where did Bobby Lee go? Bobby Lee had an old publication from Extension. I don't know if it's, there you are. Yes, he mentioned this to us, that talks about how to build shelving for lights. And most people use the shop lights. And his publication used dowels and plywood and some hooks, really inexpensive, $50 to build a whole set. Is that publication still available, Darren? Yeah. Okay, maybe we can get a link to it on our website, because I didn't order that one for today. And I know that's very similar to what Sandy Williams uses. He has a whole room in his basement. It doesn't have any windows. It's all these shelves. And the important part is to have chains so that you can raise and lower the lights, because you want them as close to those containers as you can get them, as close to the plants, the top of the plants. Ideally, they're within an inch of the top of the plants. Of course, they're growing and you keep having to back it off. 4-foot shop lights will fit 2 of these lengthwise. These are standard 11 by 22. There's also a 17 by 17, but this is pretty standard. Or, so 2 of them lengthwise or 4 of them sideways. And here's the thing about cutting them apart. If you're growing them sideways, it's quite obvious when you do it that the ones in the middle are getting more light because they grow much better. But if you've cut them apart, you can just rotate them when you raise the lights to keep it all more even. So, okay. Sorry, I'm not as organized as I was last time. Heat mats, I don't know anybody. Does anyone in here try the heat mats, use the heat mats? Yeah?
I did last year.
And they worked well for you? You used them last year? So they're like a big heating pad that's waterproof, and then it goes underneath your flat. So if you don't have too many flats or you have a lot of money, they really work well. But I usually have about, I don't know, sometimes 24 flats going in my house at the same time. So.
I was very selective about what I put. The ones that I worried about were on the heat mat.
Okay, so she was very selective. The ones that she worried about, she put on the heat mat. The ones that needed more heat to get going. Thank you. Let's see. So then once the plants are up, I've usually planted more than 1 seed per cell, especially if it's cheap seed. And I pick the one that looks the healthiest, not necessarily the tallest. Sometimes the tallest one's kind of scraggly and it isn't going to stand up when I transplant it. I pick the stockiest, darkest looking ones with no deformed leaves. And it's easy to try to take too much sympathy on them and think that, oh, okay, it doesn't look that great now, but you know, it'll snap out of it. Well, it won't. It won't. Just cut it out. And literally I take a little manicure scissors and snip them out, and then I try to yank them off the soil so they're not there collecting any kind of disease. And my plants, I don't ever up-pot them because I don't usually grow things for more than 4 weeks. They usually go straight to the garden. But if you're growing flowers, or if you're starting a lot of seed together in a tighter space, professional flower growers usually plant a row of tiny seeds, and then they prick out the little plants and move them to the individual cells as they go along. They're trying to maximize their space in the greenhouse. But I don't usually transplant. But at any rate, you want to make sure, if you're going to leave them there for very long, that they have plenty of water and plenty to eat, because if they slow down, it's just not going to work out. And again, it's better to plant them later in the garden or a younger plant than it is to do it the other way around. Every year I try starting some in January, and then by February I remember that I don't have anywhere to go with them and that they look really spindly. So don't feel, if you haven't started any yet, that you're behind, because you're not at all. You could start them mid-March and have every bit as beautiful garden as I will. And I started some to bring for this class, but then since I'm not growing them regularly, It's different too. During the peak season, you're probably looking at them every day. But when you start some in mid-January for mid-February demonstration and then forget them on the top of the fridge, they get about 6 inches tall and white and scraggly, and they will never recover from that. So it's just time to start over. So before you put your plants out, you're going to want to harden them off, which means getting them used to being outdoors. And if they've been inside, and especially if they're somewhere where there is no air movement in the house, they have a really thin cuticle. The outside of the plant is really thin. And if you took a plant from that conditions and put it out in the wind, it would kill over in like 5 minutes. You know, it's like putting it in the back of your pickup truck and driving down the highway. It's just going to kill them. So hopefully you can start out on a lighter day and put them out for maximum 2 hours, depending on the conditions, even on a rainy day, because they're less likely to collapse, as long as it's not flooding the containers, but a lightly raining day, and then extend it over the course of a week or 10 days until you transplant them into your garden. Now for me, I usually put them out with a piece of floating row cover on them. I moved out of the picture, didn't I, Brad? Okay, with a piece of floating row cover over them. And, oh, it's the same thing that happened last time I tried to do this demonstration. So I put it over top. It's okay. And I use the stakes evenly placed around to try to hold the row cover up off the plant. And then I set the whole thing inside the plastic lid to hold the row, so the row cover is sandwiched between there, and then I can scoot them around on the deck. I put them out where they're getting more light, but if it's raining too heavily, I move them back under the eave, and I always check to make sure they're not sitting in water. So since they're going out this way, and I put them out as soon as I can stand to kick them out of the house. So they're growing up pretty sturdy to start with, and then they're going into covered beds. So I don't really have that same kind of hardening off thing where I work all day, but somehow I'm supposed to put them out for 2 hours in the middle of the day. That doesn't really work for me. So this is my answer to it. And for the cabbage family, putting them out always covered like this helps to keep the cabbage fly, the cabbage maggot flies off of there. The maggots are what eats the roots, but the flies are what lays the eggs for those maggots. And about half my garden is cabbage family. So that works really well for me. When I plant them, I put some granular organic fertilizer in the bottom of the hole, and I have this little shaker made from a juice bottle. And I don't know how well you can see this, but I cut a little X in the top, drilled some holes, cut an X so I can shake some into the holes. And this is my favorite way to fertilize my plants. But this same granular organic fertilizer that works so well when it's buried in the garden doesn't work at all if you apply it as an afterthought on your transplants in the house. It turns instantly to mold, and you pretty much have to like replace the drywall. Just don't go there. So in the house, try to use something soluble, or at the very least something that's mixed in with the soil, so it's not turning into a layer of mold at the top. And that layer of mold will also lead to even more damping off, and your plants will keel over. Once the damping off is started, there's nothing you can do to fix it. You can just get rid of the plant is all you can possibly do. Sometimes you may get compost gnats in the house. They're just tiny little flying things, and they're probably not white socks or anything that bites. They're harmless, they're just annoying. Sometimes the eggs are in the potting soil. Okay, that's about all I want to talk about that. Does anybody have any questions about that section before we go on to talking about building local soils?
Is there anything wrong with just buying those little peat pots that you add water to and they grow off?
The little peat pots, the Jiffy pots, they're kind of, I think they're kind of expensive. The only problem I've ever had with them is you don't want to put the seed in before you expand them, because the seed ends up at some random depth depending on how deep that little hole they made was. But no, I think they can work very well. And I know they make trays for them that have the holes that they drop down in. I'd almost rather grow them on a flat thing so they have that same root pruning effect of using the soil blockers, because if you grow them in the tray, they can have that circling root problem. But you should be able to see it. They pull out pretty easily. They have the mesh around them, and they pull out. And just check to make sure that there's no circling roots that are going to be an issue, though. Usually for vegetables, they're not going to grow so big that it will matter anyway. Yeah, they can be good. And they don't ever come with fertilizer, though, do they? You definitely need to fertilize them. Any other questions? Yes.
I had a friend recommend using eggshells and growing in your eggshells so you could just plant it from that. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't heard of that. I assume you have to put a hole in it? So that, has anyone else tried that? Did you put a hole in it to?
No, I didn't really.
No hole. So plant them in eggshells, half eggshells, and use those as a transplant pot. Interesting idea. And then did you break the eggshell as you put it in so that it would drain?
No, it just kind of seeps on through it.
Okay, see if the roots spill over the side. Okay.
I use a lot of paper egg cartons and toilet paper rolls.
Paper egg cartons and toilet paper rolls.
They
And
dissolve really nicely once they're in the garden, and you don't have to pull anything out of its container.
okay, so do you put a hole in the bottom of the paper egg cartons, each little thing? No?
Just fine.
They drain fine. Okay, good. Bobby?
I'm watering your seedlings. I found that I do a better job if I water in the tray and not on the plants and let it percolate up.
So Bobby waters from underneath. He puts the water in the tray and lets it percolate up.
You don't want to put too much in.
But being careful not to put too much in. I've noticed that when my tray is really dry, when I first plant the seeds, it seems to take about 2 quarts per tray for it to soak it all up and not go over. Of course, once it's wet, it's going to take a whole lot less than that. But there again, check the bottom, make sure they're not sitting in water. Brad?
We go through a whole process of from seed growing things to 4-inch pots and just eventually, what is the best time to put it outside and under your hoop cover?
So Brad asks, he said they go through several transitions of uppotting. When's the best time to put it out under the hoop? Unless anyone else has a better suggestion, for me it's when I'm running out of space in the house, I put it out in the garden. But I have limited space in both the house and the garden. So for me, part of the reason I grow transplants is so that it maximizes my space overall, so that a little plant that's only 1 inch square isn't taking up the maximum amount of space in the garden. By the time it's growing there, it's already larger and it goes boom. What other rules do people follow?
So the 4-inch pot's unnecessary?
I don't know what it is that you're growing and how long of a season. Like, for example, if you were growing like...
Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi.
Okay, yeah, all of the cold crops like Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi, they're pretty hardy. In fact, I have some collards out right now in the garden that are doing pretty okay. Some of the leaves have broken off under the snow, but when the snow goes away, they're still there, and I think they're going to take off again. So other than in the winter when things don't grow anyway because of the lack of the light, no, I wouldn't do that. And especially the cabbage family, they're much hardier when they're 4 weeks old than they are when they're 8 weeks old. And they love to be out there. I interplant things so that I'm making good use of the space, that something next to it's going to come out by the time it's bigger. And that's part of the beauty, too, of having lots of transplants, is I can maximize that space.
You were saying you put some of yours in the ground in April and then cover them with hoops?
Well,
Where's your garden at?
I live on Mendenhall Peninsula, and yes, I do put some of my plants out in April, and it's not any kind of a problem because I actually, my hoops are up right now, and I have plastic that's open on the ends and 6 feet wide, and then I have, which I wouldn't recommend, but I have 2 3-foot wide floating row cover hoops inside that. So mine are actually double hooped. They're under the floating row cover for warmth, and then they're under the plastic to keep most of the rain out. And the soil is loose and good to go. And yeah, it doesn't hurt a hardy broccoli plant when it's young to go out into that, and the cabbage family. The chard does not like it that early. I wouldn't put celery out that early. A lot of the things that aren't in the cabbage family, in fact most of them, I just wouldn't put out that early. But the cabbage family, yeah, I push them really hard. I have fun with them, and they respond.
How early do you put out your peas?
My peas, how early do I put them out? Well, it's going to be the end of this week this year because, but this is the way I push the envelope. Okay, so I put the peas in a pot that has some hoops around it so they can just stay in there. And I planted them and put them in the heated garage. And then I'm going away next week, and I'm going to put them under the eave on my deck. And there's a surprising number of things that have survived there before. And so I'm going to see what happens to them. Traditionally, people put them out on St. Patrick's Day, and they will germinate in much colder soil than most crops will. Peas, snow peas, really like the cold. So yeah, the potatoes are the first things I put out, but potatoes can rot in cold soil. So, and I don't grow potatoes because of my space limitations. But yeah, be brave with the peas, and the seed is cheap. Try some early, try some later, succession plant them. Yeah. Jay?
Do you notice the flavor difference in vegetables that you plant either particularly early in the season or late in the season as opposed to describing the peak?
So do I notice a flavor difference in the vegetables between the early and late season? I haven't noticed that, although typically cabbage family plants sweeten up if they have some cold towards the end when you harvest them. But we have a lot of cold, and I change varieties a lot, and I don't think I'm consistent enough to be a good judge of whether or not they taste different at different parts of the season. Does anyone else have an opinion on that?
Okay, I'm David Lendrum, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can find and mix locally to make your soils better. And do I need the microphone? Is there anyone in the back that can't hear me easily? Okay, so I'll just go on like that then. I am a little bit louder. So most of what we have here are very, very young soils. Young meaning in the terms of their evolution and their geological time. The glaciers went away not very long ago, and so what they left behind them are in most cases hardly suitable for the purposes that we want to put them. There are occasional areas, the downtown flats that have received the wash down from the streams from the mountains that have carried topsoil down there. If you are lucky enough to live down there, you can grow right in those kinds of soils without very much additional work to it. Remember that the things that are soil determined are not so much fertility or acidity. They're much more textural. They're much more, is it going to have enough air space? Is it going to hold water? Is it going to let water through it? Those are the most critical things. We have so much rain. We have such cool weathers that what we really want is soils that will drain the excess water away or stop them from getting wet, as Susan has done, by keeping them covered like that. But you want to be able to make sure that there's what's called pore space in it. If you take a handful of the dirt and you squeeze it together as hard as you can, and you open your hand up and it stays like a little slug wound up there, then it means that it doesn't have enough pore space in it. It doesn't have large enough particles. What determines the different characteristics of soil in many instances is not so much where it came from as in how big the pieces are that pack together in it. And silt and clay and sand are different from each other according to how big the soil pieces are. Sand is the biggest, clay is the littlest. But they can be very, very similar substances, just being in different sizes. And what you're going to do is to like a cocktail mixer. You're going to blend those things together. The bigger particles are going to provide more airspace, but very rarely are they going to let nutrients bind to them. Nutrients are like salt. And when salt gets wet, it breaks into its component ions. And those have electrical charges to them. And they are looking for their opposite numbers to hold on to. And so when you want nutrients to be available in the soil, you want to have a mixture of particle sizes so you can have some that are small enough and have electrically charged surfaces that will absorb and hold those pieces, and some that are large enough to allow enough airspace to pass through it and enough water space to go away. The tops of the plants need carbon dioxide, the roots need oxygen. And if you can't get oxygen to them, they just won't grow. So there needs to be enough open pore space in these soils to be able to have the oxygen transfer there. Luckily, we have here plenty of sand, we have lots of gravel, and we do have an abundant source of native peat. And if you'd, at the end of this session, like to come up and look, this is peat that came out of one of the local uplifted muskegs, and I just buy it and stack it for a few years and let the water drain out of it, and it turns out to be an absolutely marvelous substance. And one of the reasons why people grew in peat for so many years is that it does provide adequate pore space, it provides support. There's no nutrient in it. Whatever nutrient you're going to give, you're going to have to add to it. And if it's going to be someplace that's going to be at ground level, then you're going to have to pay more attention to getting more large particles into it. If you're going to put them in a raised bed, then that act of raising soils up above ground level has a lot to do with getting the water out of it. And remember, water transfers heat rapidly, it transfers cold rapidly. One of the reasons you want water out is so that the air space is available, but it's also so it warms up earlier. If you have a raised bed, the soil will warm up sooner. If you have a raised bed with a cover on it, it'll even warm up sooner. And if you have a raised bed with a cover on it and floating row cover underneath it, it's even warmer like that. And so you're looking at insulation layers. That's really it's very obvious when you think about it. Now, when you see old gardens in southeast Alaska, you see that they are hilled up. And the reason they do that is that without having to put boards or rocks or steel or anything in their garden, that act of making the mound lets those mounds provide raised beds. So you're looking at ways to get the water away from it. When you blend soils together, you can do it in small quantities to do a little garden area. You can do it right where it is, dig the elements in together. And if you're doing it in larger quantities, you may want to do it on some kind of a surface where you're actually mixing them together as if they were kinds of grain or flours for your bread. And as far as the nutrient sources, what Susan was saying is right on. There are so many places to get fertilizers. You can use organically derived fertilizers. You can use commercially derived fertilizers. You can use no fertilizers and rely on just luck. But they need it. They need to be fed, and you can tell from looking at the leaves when something is beyond the edge. If it starts to get yellow, it's generally going to need to have some nitrogen. If it starts getting red, it's generally going to need to have some phosphorus. And our soils are notoriously poor in phosphorus around here. So that's kind of something you're going to see if you plant things just in the regular soil. In a month, they're going to look great. In 2 months, they're going to have red edges to them, and the color of the stems is going to get red. And later on in the season, this is something you often see in your garden. You see things getting red. Look at them and you think, oh, maybe it's too cold. Generally, it's the fact that they don't have enough phosphorus in them. Now, those substances get nitrogen goes away real easily. Phosphorus and potash hang around a long time. And so if you want to have adding a balanced fertilizer in the beginning of the season is a good idea. Later in the season, you're probably not going to need much else than nitrogen because there's still going to be plenty of phosphorus and potash right there in the area that you put it. And when people do fertilizing their growing garden, they're going to put fertilizer into the beds before they plant in them, and then later on when they come along, they're not going to dig the soil back up to add fertilizer. You're going to add it in what's called sideband, and that's where you go not right at the base of the plant, but out a little ways, so the fertilizer is getting spread across the top of the surface, but not right up against the stems of the plants. We're talking about making soils in large quantities, so if you were looking at doing a landscape scale, then you want to do it, with something like a rototiller. And you can spread the layers of material out. You can get peat soils, you can get clay soils, and you can get sand, and you layer them in and run your rototiller back and forth over them. The stables here offer horse manure for the carrying away. And it's rich in nutrients, and it's rich in organic matter, but it's also real rich in weed seeds. So if you were planning to use it as a nutrient source in your garden, bury it. Don't ever dig it back up again. It's hard to use horse manure in a vegetable garden area. It's okay to do it in an ornamental area where you're not going to dig it back up again, but if it's something you're going to keep turning over, the big weed seed we worry about here is chickweed. And chickweed seeds are viable for 50 years, and they need light in order to germinate. So if you have got them in your garden and you're growing it, you know, pulling them out is never going to get it. You know, what you're going to have to do is you have to bury that layer and keep it buried. And I can't tell you how many people's yards I've been to, and they say, and I got all this great manure and dug it into my garden, and now I've got these chickweeds. I don't know where they came from. But it's a hand-in-hand combination. They are edible. That's right. And so is miner's lettuce. Actually, almost everything is. People eat everything. You know, people eat tulips. But are they palatable or desirable? That's a whole other question. And, in fact, you can train yourself to like an awful lot of things. So, if you look around at where you live in the town and measure how far you are from the glacier, that's going to tell you a lot about how well developed your soils are. And if you go out there and look around, now in many cases it doesn't make any difference because the soils around your home are not the ones that were laid down there naturally. They're ones that were delivered out of dump trucks and put into piles around there. Not in the older parts of town. You know, in the older parts of town, that wasn't the habit. People built their homes on the soils that were there, dug them out, kept those soils. It wasn't like things that have been built in the last 40 years. The last 40 years, pretty much, if you're going to build, you dig away all that soil, put something else in its place, and then build the house on it. And if the people want soil, they have to buy it. Now, 2 years ago at the gardening conference, at the greenhouse conference, there was a survey done with local topsoil suppliers, and they were comparing the amount of organic matter that was available in the different mixes. And you know, even something that looks really dark and looks like it should be 80% organic, by the time they wash it and burn it, it's not. If you want organic matter in your soils, you're pretty much going to have to add it to it. And if you're going to buy topsoil from one of the topsoil suppliers, what you're mostly concerned with is particle size and the amount of silt that's in it. Because even though it has a big sign on it that says top quality topsoil, you still want to do due diligence. And what you do is you take a mayonnaise jar and you take a handful of the soil and you put it in that and you screw the top on, fill it with water, screw the top on, shake it up and let it sit for a day. And soil particles settle according to their weight and size. And so you can then see how much of it is silt, how much of it is sand, how much of it is the organic fraction. It's surprising, even from different areas in the same property. It's really surprising what a difference there is. And what you're going to want to do, of course, once you see that and once you see what you have, if it's something that has mostly sand, then you need to add some more organic matter to it. If it's something that is mostly silt, which will be the smallest particle and that which will be settled down there, because the clay you won't really see. The clay particles are so small you won't really see them. But you will see the silty stuff. And if it's mostly silty material, then you're going to want to add something that's bigger pieces. Is that confusing? Okay. Well, that's pretty much what I know about it. You know, and what I do mostly is I grow mostly in straight peat. And I put it up above the ground, and I put it in piles, and I plant right in that. Yes, Darren?
Do you want to talk about adjusting the pH at all to work when you do that, generally?
I never do. And I'm sure that if I were more of a technician, I really would, because that's what determines nutrient availability. And our adjusting the pH, which means the acidity and the alkalinity. And there are very well-known levels that you can easily find. I'm sure that the extension publications have some that show the lenses of materials and what's available at different pHs in your soil. And I know that soil testing, do you do that through your office?
I can help direct people to soil testing services and how to
Nutrient level. And the nutrient level lab left town, so we no longer have a real good local source for that.
It's only $16 per sample, and it's very quick results, and I can help you interpret the results and talk about recommendations and stuff.
How about composting? Do you compost?
Tons.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely tons. And I do it for a lot of reasons. You know, mostly having to do with the entry level. I don't want to deal with all that garbage.
Yeah.
You know, I want to find a way to make sure that that stuff gets handled. And in designing my garden spaces, I always look for something like that. I try and make a space very near to where I'm growing, to where I'm going to compost material, so I can do all that stuff right there. And composting, I got an email today through the composting co-op in Douglas, which I didn't even know existed until today. I thought, now there's a hot number. And she said that she went out and tested her compost this morning. It was 150 degrees in her compost pile. I thought, now she is really onto something. So that means she must have really good airflow, because that's what determines how fast the compost works. You have to have a good recipe of carbon to nitrogen, but really it has to do just like a wood stove. You know, you need to get enough ventilation going through it in order to make sure that the populations of the microorganisms can peak along.
Do you make compost tea, and at what point would you put them on your seedlings?
I don't make compost tea. Like I said, most of my compost activity is to manage waste. I have a friend who is the compost tea prophet, and she operates out of the Seattle area, but the compost tea that they use for spraying for disease suppression is a real aerated form. And when they make the tea with it, they take the compost and put it in a digester and blow oxygen up through it. So it's a bubbling, seething mass, and the bacteria and the fungi are reproducing at incredible rates that way. If you're looking for it as a nutrient source, then I imagine that as soon as you have the cotyledons open and the new leaf is starting to grow, that's a good time to have that kind of stuff.
Seaweed and seashells.
Seaweed is a wonderful source both of organic matter in your soils and micronutrient. But remember, seaweed is 99% water. So when you're gathering it, you need to gather copious quantities of it. And our present arboretum was built on seaweed and dead fish in sand. And for many, many years, that family gathered seaweed and sand and seaweed and fish and put it into their soils, and it's a marvelous soil now. And during the old times, when the potatoes first came to southeast Alaska and the Tlinkits were introduced to them, they grew potatoes on the beach in seaweed beds and had marvelous production. And that's not due to inherent fertility in the sand. You know, it has to do with there is enough nutrient in the seaweed materials. Now, if you're looking at seashells as a way of managing acidity, it's hard to get the calcium out of the seashell. You know, laying them around is more decorative. If you want to get the calcium carbonate out of it, you're going to have to do some crushing and milling, and so that you can get it mixed in. But what it also does provide is it does provide a lot of the aeration space in the soils. Please.
There's a little island that you can just take your skiff out, and I go out with buckets, 5-gallon buckets, and get the crushed seashells, because I live out by the glacier, and my soil's so tight, it really helps with that.
It looks so pretty too.
And it's a lot easier when you want to grow things that want to grow down.
Yes, it certainly is. And remember, the roots are not going to grow beyond the depth to which the oxygen is available. You don't need a foot of really good soil to grow things like cabbages. You know, you're looking at something, if you have 8 inches of soil, you got enough space for that, because the roots are mostly growing like this.
Do you need to wash the salt off of the seaweed?
Nobody else does. You know, it rains so much that it's just going away. Uh-huh.
About coffee grounds, lots of coffee grounds.
Well, my friend who has an earthworm farm in the Willamette Valley says that that's his main source of bedding material, that they pile the coffee grounds up and let the worms eat them, and then he grows everything in the world in that. I can't say it in terms of a soil additive here. I really don't know. You know?
I got tons of them this fall. I was getting like 4, out of a 5-gallon bucket, I was getting 4 gallons a day for about 2 months, and I just put it all over my yard. See it this spring.
Darren says it's really high in nitrogen, so that's a big addition to it. So does anybody have any recipes that they've had wonderful success with?
For compost?
I put 3 truckloads of fair-weather stable horse manure with 2 truckloads of sand, and that's how I made all my raised beds. And then since I live on the beach in North Douglas, I've been hauling up 55-gallon garbage cans of seaweed, and I covered all of that. And what's best is when it freezes and it dries out, and that seaweed is just crunchy. I go out and march all over top of it so that it gets into the soil, because as soon as it rains, it reconstitutes itself back into a slimy mess.
And I bet it grows things wonderfully.
It does.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know where else we'll go from here tonight. Susan, that was a marvelous presentation, as are they all.
Well, if you have chickweed issues, if you just cover them up, like if you bought dirt from potting soil dirt and put a layer of that on top, how much would you have to cover the chickweed so it wouldn't grow back through?
Well, what you really want to do is you want to cover it up with 3 or 4 inches of soil and plant something on it that you're not going to disturb. If it's in your garden, you're kind of stuck. I mean, if it's in the vegetable garden you're going to grow your food in, you're going to always be manipulating those soils, and the seeds are going to still come up. So maybe in that case you're going to have to take off the top 4 inches of soil and put something else back on top. I know people who have problems with those soil-borne fungus bodies like liverworts do the same kind of thing. They bury them. And the same thing with fungus gnats in many cases when people have them around in their interior plants. They just bury them under 2 inches of sand.
So, do you put weeds in your compost? What do you do with weeds?
I put them in my compost. I put horsetails in my compost. I put horse manure in my compost. And I put diseased leaves in my compost. And I put rotten old cabbages in my compost. I do all that stuff. Because from...
Buttercups?
I put buttercups in my compost.
There was one mention that spreading grass clippings over top of your vegetable garden enhances the nitrogen in the soil, but also keeps weeds down. What would your recommendation be?
No problem with that. You just don't want to get so much there that it makes a cakey layer. If you can get enough on there that's going to be easily absorbed, you know, 1/2 inch at a time, that's okay. But don't go putting 1.5 inches of wet grass clippings over the top of your soil. It'll really stink, and it'll really raise a lot of fungal problems.
I wonder whether the Gardeners Association could put something on the website about the Douglas Composting Co-op.
Good idea.
What's our feeling about that?
Okay, so our next session is March 14, something like that.
Second Wednesday.
Second Wednesday. We look forward to seeing you all then.